Sarah and James had been in love for 3 years, and now they were ready to take the next big step, getting married. Sarah, a bright and cheerful young woman with a passion for art, came from a traditional white family. James, a kind and thoughtful man who worked as a software engineer, came from a humble background and was raised by his father, Mr. Williams, after his mother passed away when he was a child. The couple's love story was simple but beautiful. They met at a community event where Sarah had volunteered to paint a mural, and James had been helping with the technical setup. From the moment they started talking, their connection was undeniable. They shared values like kindness, honesty, and family. Over time, their bond grew stronger, and now they were excited to celebrate their love with family and friends. However, there was one issue that Sarah was worried about: her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Donovan. While they had always loved and supported her, she knew they held traditional views about marriage. They were polite to James when they met him, but Sarah had noticed the subtle comments they made about his background. They would say things like, "He's nice, but his upbringing is so different from ours," or, "I wonder if he'll fit into our social circle." These comments upset Sarah, but she hoped they would grow to see James for the wonderful person he was. The situation became even more tense when Sarah told her parents that James's father, Mr. Williams, would be attending the wedding. Mr. Williams had worked as a carpenter all his life and had always lived modestly. The Donovans, who took pride in their wealthy lifestyle, seemed unimpressed when they heard about him. Will he be comfortable in such a formal setting? Mrs. Donovan had asked one evening, her tone light, but her meaning clear. Sarah defended Mr. Williams immediately. "He's James's father, and he's one of the most hardworking and kind people I've ever met. He belongs there as much as anyone else." Despite her efforts, Sarah could tell her parents weren't thrilled. She felt a mix of frustration and sadness, but she decided to focus on the wedding. She believed love and understanding would eventually bring everyone together. James, on the other hand, was fully aware of the situation but chose to stay positive. "Let's not worry too much," he told Sarah one evening. "My dad has faced challenges before, and he always handles them with grace. He'll be fine." As the wedding day approached, the excitement grew. Sarah and James were busy finalizing details, but the underlying tension between their families lingered. Sarah could only hope that when the two families met, the love and joy of the occasion would outweigh the differences. Little did anyone know, Mr. Williams was preparing something special, a gesture that would change everything. The pre-wedding dinner was set to be the first time Sarah's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Donovan, would meet James's father, Mr. Williams. Sarah had spent days planning the evening, hoping to create a warm and welcoming atmosphere. She chose a cozy restaurant with a private room, decorated with elegant candles and flowers, to make the occasion feel special. But as the day approached, Sarah couldn't shake her nerves. She knew her parents could be judgmental, and she didn't want them to make Mr. Williams feel uncomfortable. "Just be yourself," she told James's father over the phone. "That's more than enough." Mr. Williams chuckled warmly. "Don't worry about me, Sarah. I'm coming to celebrate you and James. That's all that matters." When the evening arrived, Sarah and James were the first to get to the restaurant. Sarah's parents arrived next, dressed in formal attire and looking around the room with approval. "It's lovely," Mrs. Donovan commented, her voice calm but slightly distant. Moments later, Mr. Williams entered. He was a tall man with kind eyes and a strong handshake. He wore a neatly pressed suit, though it was clear it wasn't new. "Good evening," he said warmly as he approached the Donovans. Mr. Donovan extended a hand, but glanced quickly at Mr. Williams's shoes, which were polished but worn. "Nice to meet you," he said, his tone polite but lacking warmth. Mrs. Donovan smiled thinly. "Yes, lovely to meet you." The group sat down, and the conversation began. Sarah tried her best to keep things light, talking about the wedding plans and how excited she and James were. But no matter how hard she tried, the Donovans couldn't hide their judgmental glances and subtle remarks. "So, Mr. Williams," Mr. Donovan said, leaning back in his chair, "what line of work are you in?" "I'm a retired carpenter," Mr. Williams replied with pride. "I spent 35 years building homes and furniture. It was hard work, but I loved it." "Carpentry, how interesting," Mrs. Donovan said, her tone more curious than kind. "I suppose it's quite different from what James does now." Mr. Williams smiled, unfazed. "Yes, but I like to think the values I taught James, hard work, honesty, and respect, are the foundation for everything he's achieved." Sarah noticed her parents exchanging a quick look, but she chose to ignore it. She knew they didn't appreciate Mr. Williams's humble background, but she admired his dignity. Throughout the evening, Mr. Williams remained calm and composed. He answered every question thoughtfully, and even shared a few stories about raising James on his own. While Sarah's parents didn't seem particularly impressed, other guests at the dinner were drawn to his warmth and sincerity. As the evening ended, Mr. Williams stood to leave. "Thank you for the lovely evening," he said with a genuine smile. "Of course," Mrs. Donovan replied, though her tone was still distant. As Mr. Williams walked out, Sarah couldn't help but feel proud of him. She just wished her parents could see the incredible person he truly was. After the dinner, Sarah couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in her chest. Her parents had been polite, but the way they had looked at Mr. Williams, her future father-in-law, left her with a sinking feeling. She tried not to let it bother her, but she couldn't help but notice the subtle disapproval in their eyes. James, however, seemed calm as always. "Don't worry about them, Sarah. I know it's hard, but my dad is used to people judging him. He's been through a lot." Sarah nodded, but deep down, she wished her parents could understand what made Mr. Williams so special. The next day, Sarah sat with her father, Mr. Donovan, in the living room. They were discussing the upcoming wedding, but it was clear there was still tension. "I just don't get it, Sarah," her father said, shaking his head. "You've always been so careful about who you choose to spend time with, and then you pick him." Sarah's heart skipped a beat, but she kept her voice steady. "Dad, James is an amazing person. You don't see him the way I do. He's kind, hardworking, and caring. Why can't you just accept that?" Mr. Donovan sighed. "It's not that we don't accept him, Sarah. It's just, his background is so different from ours. I don't know if he'll fit in." Sarah's frustration grew. Why does his background matter? Can't you just see him for who he is? Meanwhile, James was sitting at home with his father, Mr. Williams, going over the final details of the wedding. Mr. Williams was a quiet man, but his thoughts were always deep. He didn't show his emotions easily, but he had noticed the way the Donovans had treated him the night before. He knew they didn't approve of him, and it bothered him a little. James had always admired his father's strength. Growing up, Mr. Williams had worked long hours to provide for James after his mother passed away. He hadn't been able to give James everything money could buy, but he had given him something much more valuable: a strong sense of right and wrong, the importance of hard work, and the courage to stand tall in any situation. Mr. Williams had seen how uncomfortable the Donovans were, and he understood. People like them often couldn't see beyond their own world, and he didn't expect them to. But what bothered him most was seeing how it affected Sarah. She was torn between her love for James and the pressure from her parents. As they discussed the wedding, Mr. Williams said something that stuck with James. "I don't expect them to change, son, but I'll always do my best to show them who I really am. I'm not perfect, but I've always tried to be a good man, and I'll always be there for you, no matter what." James nodded, appreciating his father's wisdom. He had learned so much from him over the years, and now he had to be the strong one. "Thanks, Dad. I'll do my best to make sure they understand who I am too." Mr. Williams smiled. "That's all anyone can do, son." The wedding day had finally arrived, and Sarah was filled with excitement and nervousness all at once. She had spent months planning every detail of the day she had dreamed about for so long. The ceremony was going to take place in a beautiful church, followed by a reception at a lovely reception hall. Everything was perfect, except for the tension between her parents and James's father, Mr. Williams. Sarah tried not to let it bother her, but it was hard to ignore. She had hoped that with time, her parents would come to see Mr. Williams in a different light. But on this important day, she could feel the unease between them. Every time her father spoke about Mr. Williams, he seemed to choose his words carefully, almost like he was trying to avoid saying something wrong. Sarah could see it in the way he looked at James's father, polite but distant. James, on the other hand, was in high spirits. He was excited to marry Sarah and didn't want to let anything ruin the day. He had been looking forward to this moment for years, and nothing, especially the tension between the families, was going to bring him down. He smiled at Sarah, his calm presence a comforting reminder that everything would be okay. As the guests began to arrive at the church, Sarah couldn't help but feel her nerves creep back up. She stood at the entrance, watching as family and friends filed into their seats. When her parents walked in, Sarah noticed how they seemed to make a point of sitting as far from Mr. Williams as possible. He had arrived just a few moments before, his presence steady and warm, though Sarah could tell he was a little uncomfortable with the chilly reception. Mr. Williams walked slowly up to the front of the church, taking his seat with dignity. He glanced around the room, greeting a few friends of James who had arrived early. He had never been one for grand events, but he was happy to be there for his son on such an important day. Sarah joined James, and they stood side by side at the front of the church. The ceremony was about to begin. The music started, and as Sarah walked down the aisle, she tried to ignore the nagging feeling in her stomach. She looked at her parents, who seemed to be paying attention to the ceremony, but there was still an air of awkwardness around them. The vows were exchanged, and Sarah and James became husband and wife. The moment was perfect, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that her parents weren't fully present. She hoped that as the evening wore on, things might change. She wanted her family to feel the love and joy that she and James shared, but she feared that the tension would continue to hang in the air. At the reception, Sarah smiled and laughed, but she could still feel the distance between her parents and Mr. Williams. She couldn't help but worry about what would happen next. Would things ever change between their families? Could they ever truly accept each other? As the night went on, Sarah looked at James and saw the happiness in his eyes. That gave her hope. She loved him with all her heart, and she knew that, with time, everything would work out. But for now, all they could do was enjoy the moment. The reception was in full swing, and guests were enjoying the delicious food and music. Sarah and James had just finished their first dance, and the room was filled with laughter and celebration. But despite the happiness around her, Sarah couldn't help but notice the continued distance between her parents and Mr. Williams. She had hoped that with the wedding ceremony behind them, things would become easier, but the tension was still thick in the air. James noticed it too. He had always been a calm person, but even he couldn't ignore the awkwardness between their families. "Let's not worry about it right now," he whispered to Sarah as they sat down at their table. "Tonight is about us." Sarah smiled at him, grateful for his support. She took his hand, feeling comforted by his presence. It was true. This day was supposed to be about their love and the future they would share. But Sarah couldn't help but feel the weight of her parents' disapproval. She wanted them to see Mr. Williams for who he really was, a hard-working, kind man who had done everything he could for his son. As the night continued, the speeches began. Several friends and family members stood up to offer their congratulations and share their thoughts on the couple. Everyone laughed and clapped, but Sarah's mind kept drifting back to her parents and Mr. Williams. She knew her father wasn't completely comfortable, but she wished he could see how much James admired his father and how much he had taught him. Finally, it was Mr. Williams's turn to speak. Sarah had been wondering when he would take the microphone. He wasn't one for long speeches, but she knew he had something important to say. As he stood up from his seat, the room grew quiet, and all eyes turned toward him. He cleared his throat, and with a warm smile, he began. Thank you, everyone, for being here to celebrate Sarah and James today. This is a very special moment for both of them, and it means the world to me to be here with all of you." Sarah watched as Mr. Williams spoke, his voice calm and steady. She could feel the sincerity in his words, and she knew that whatever he said next would be something that would touch everyone's hearts. "But before I finish," he continued, "I want to give James and Sarah a gift. It's not much, but it's something that means a lot to me." Mr. Williams reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small wrapped box. He held it up for everyone to see. The guests looked at each other, curious about the contents of the box. Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. She had no idea what he was about to give them, but she could sense that it was something meaningful. Mr. Williams stepped forward and handed the box to James and Sarah. James carefully unwrapped the box, revealing the beautifully carved wooden sculpture. It was a figure of two people standing together, their hands intertwined in a symbol of unity. The craftsmanship was stunning, and Sarah could tell that a lot of time and care had gone into creating it. The figure represented everything Mr. Williams believed in: family, love, and togetherness. Tears filled Sarah's eyes as she looked at the sculpture. She could feel the emotion behind the gift, and she knew that this simple, yet powerful gesture would speak volumes to everyone in the room. The guests sat in stunned silence, admiring the sculpture. Even her parents, who had been distant all evening, were visibly moved. For the first time that day, Sarah felt a sense of peace. Mr. Williams's gift had broken through the tension, and in that moment, she could see a change in the way her parents looked at him. It was clear that this was more than just a gift. It was a gesture of love, understanding, and respect. The room was quiet as everyone admired the wooden sculpture Mr. Williams had given Sarah and James. It wasn't the usual type of gift a newlywed couple would expect. There were no sparkling diamonds or fancy appliances, but this gift spoke volumes. The carefully carved figure of two people standing hand in hand was a symbol of unity, love, and hard work. It was something Mr. Williams had made with his own hands, and that made it even more special. James was the first to speak after a moment of silence. He looked at the sculpture in awe, his voice thick with emotion. "Dad, this is beautiful. Thank you so much. I know how much work went into this." Sarah, too, felt tears well up in her eyes. She had known Mr. Williams was a kind man, but this gesture was something she would never forget. "This is incredible," she said softly, holding the sculpture close to her chest. "You really didn't have to do this, but I'm so glad you did." For a moment, it felt as though time stood still. The guests, who had been quietly observing, began to clap. Slowly, the room filled with applause, and Sarah could see that her parents, too, were moved. They exchanged a glance, and Sarah noticed the shift in their expressions. They were no longer just the distant, critical parents she had worried about. Something had changed in them. Something had softened. Mr. Williams stood quietly, his face filled with the same calm pride that had marked his speech earlier. He wasn't looking for praise or attention. He had simply wanted to give something meaningful to the couple. As the applause died down, he spoke again, his voice low but steady. "I spent a lot of time on this," he said. "When James was growing up, I worked hard to provide for him. But I always made sure he knew what really mattered: love, family, and respect for one another. I wanted to make something that would remind you both of those values as you build your life together." His words were simple, but they carried so much weight. For a moment, Sarah felt like everything had fallen into place. Mr. Williams wasn't just James's father. He was a man who had lived a life full of wisdom and love. His gift wasn't just a piece of art. It was a reminder of the strength of family and the power of small, thoughtful gestures. Sarah's parents were still quiet, but Sarah noticed them leaning toward each other, whispering softly. She couldn't hear what they were saying, but she could see the change in their posture. They weren't just judging anymore. They were listening, truly listening, to what Mr. Williams had shared. After a few more moments of silence, Mrs. Donovan stood up. She cleared her throat, and the room went quiet again. "Mr. Williams," she said, her voice sincere but soft, "that was a very kind gift. And your words, they've made me realize something. We've been wrong in how we've seen you. I can see now how much you care for your son and for Sarah. We're sorry if we made you feel uncomfortable." Her apology wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was heartfelt. Mr. Williams smiled, his face showing no sign of bitterness. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I just wanted you to know the kind of man James is, and the kind of family he comes from." Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had been so worried about how her parents would react, but this unexpected gift and Mr. Williams's words had done more than just break the ice. They had opened the door for understanding. The room was still, and everyone could feel the change in the air. Mr. Williams had spoken from his heart, and his gift had touched everyone deeply. Sarah looked around at the guests, and she saw something she hadn't expected. A sense of warmth and respect spreading through the room. Even her parents, who had been so distant and critical earlier, now seemed different. The tension between them and Mr. Williams had begun to melt away. Mrs. Donovan's apology had been simple, but it meant the world to Sarah. It was the first time her mother had truly acknowledged the discomfort that had been present between their families. Sarah felt a weight lift off her shoulders. She had always dreamed of a wedding where both sides of her family would come together, and now, for the first time, it seemed like that dream might come true. Her father, Mr. Donovan, was also quieter now. He wasn't as tense as he had been earlier in the evening. He stood up, walked over to Mr. Williams, and extended his hand. "Mr. Williams," he said, his voice steady but respectful, "I've been thinking about what you said. I'm sorry if I've been distant. I can see now that you've done a lot for your son. James is a good man, and you should be proud of him." Mr. Williams smiled, his weathered hands shaking slightly as he took Mr. Donovan's hand. "Thank you. It means a lot to me that you're saying that. James has always been my pride and joy. He's a man I can be proud of, and I know he'll make Sarah happy." The room seemed to breathe again, as if everyone was finally letting go of the tension that had clouded the evening. Sarah looked at James, and for the first time that day, she saw him relax. His smile was bright, his eyes full of hope. He had always believed that things would work out between their families, and now he could see that his belief was coming true. The guests, who had been quietly observing, began to talk among themselves. Whispers of admiration for Mr. Williams's speech spread through the crowd. People who had been hesitant to speak to him now found themselves drawn to him, eager to hear more about the man who had raised such a wonderful son. The respect in the room was palpable. Sarah felt a sense of pride wash over her. She had always known that James was a man of great character, and now everyone else could see it too. Her parents, who had once questioned his background and his father's humble life, were beginning to understand that what mattered most wasn't wealth or status. It was love, kindness, and the strength of family. James took Sarah's hand, and together they stood to thank their guests. "We're so grateful for all of you being here tonight," James said, his voice filled with emotion. "It means the world to us to have you all here to celebrate with us. And thank you, Dad, for that incredible gift. It's something we will always treasure." As the evening continued, Sarah noticed her parents talking more openly with Mr. Williams. There was laughter now, a sense of ease that hadn't been there before. The shift in the room was undeniable. Sarah couldn't help but smile. The families were coming together, just as she had always hoped. It wasn't perfect yet, but it was a start. And for the first time, Sarah truly believed that their two worlds could blend, that her parents and Mr. Williams could both be part of the future she and James were building together. As the evening wore on, Sarah couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed. What had started as a day filled with tension had transformed into something beautiful. Her parents, who had been so distant and judgmental at the beginning of the evening, were now openly conversing with Mr. Williams. She could hear the laughter coming from their table as they shared stories and joked with each other. It was a moment she had dreamed about, but never imagined would come so smoothly. Sarah sat quietly for a moment, watching the interaction between her parents and Mr. Williams. She had always known how wonderful James's father was, but now, seeing him through her parents' eyes, she realized just how much her father's words had meant. Mr. Williams had never been concerned with trying to impress anyone. He had always just been himself, honest, hardworking, and full of love for his family. It was this authenticity that had helped bridge the gap between their two worlds. Sarah's mother, who had been so skeptical at first, was now animatedly talking with Mr. Williams. They were discussing their shared love of gardening, and Sarah could tell her mother had genuinely warmed to him. The way they exchanged stories made Sarah smile. For the first time, she saw her mother not as someone rigid in her views, but as a person open to understanding others. Sarah's father, too, had softened. He had always been a man of principle, and perhaps that had made him so cautious about people who came from different backgrounds. But now, she could see a sense of respect in his eyes whenever he looked at Mr. Williams. He was beginning to understand what Sarah had been trying to explain all along, that James's father was a good man, not defined by his past or his job, but by the way he loved his family and lived his life. Sarah stood up and walked over to where James was sitting. He was talking to some of his old friends, but when he saw her, his face lit up. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice soft and reassuring. Sarah smiled and sat beside him. "Yeah, everything's fine. I just needed a moment to take it all in." James nodded, his hand finding hers. "It's been a long day, but I'm so happy right now." "I am too," Sarah said. "It's like something finally clicked. My parents, they're really starting to understand. They're seeing my dad for who he really is, and I couldn't ask for more." James squeezed her hand, a look of quiet pride in his eyes. "I always knew they would. It just took time." Sarah looked around the room again, taking in the scene. Guests were mingling, laughing, and enjoying the night. It was everything she had imagined, but with an added layer of meaning. The two families were coming together, building something new and beautiful from the foundation of love and understanding. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start, and that was enough. As the evening continued, Sarah felt a deep sense of gratitude for everyone in the room. She had hoped for this moment, for her family to see what she saw in James and his father. And now she was watching it unfold before her eyes. For the first time, Sarah felt like all the pieces were falling into place. She and James were beginning their new life together, surrounded by the love of their families. And with each passing moment, that love seemed to grow stronger. Looked around the room, her heart swelling with happiness. The once clear divide between her family and James had started to fade. And now, it felt like they were all one family, celebrating this new chapter in Sarah and James's life. The dance floor was alive with energy as guests danced, laughed, and shared stories. Sarah's parents were now deep in conversation with Mr. Williams, laughing at the jokes he told about James's childhood. It was such a beautiful change from the awkwardness they had displayed earlier. Sarah couldn't remember the last time she had seen her father smile like that, so relaxed and open. James's arm was around Sarah as they stood at the edge of the dance floor, looking at the happy scene unfolding before them. "It's amazing how quickly things have changed," James said quietly, his voice filled with awe. Sarah nodded. "I never imagined this day would go this smoothly. My parents, they really see my dad for who he is now. It's like they finally get it." James smiled, giving her hand a reassuring squeeze. "Your dad's a good man, Sarah. And I knew that one day they'd see that too. It just took a little time." Sarah thought about the long road it had taken to get here. The moments of tension, the awkward silences, the quiet doubts. But now, all of that seemed worth it. They had made it through, and the result was more beautiful than she had ever imagined. Her family and James's family, once so different, were now united by love and mutual respect. As the night drew to a close, Sarah felt a sense of peace that had eluded her for so long. The families were no longer strangers, and the future ahead of her and James felt full of endless possibilities. They had come a long way, but this was just the beginning. The final song of the evening began to play, a slow, romantic tune that had always been one of Sarah's favorites. She and James stepped onto the dance floor, their movements in sync as they swayed to the music. For this moment, it felt like the world had stopped, and nothing else mattered except for the two of them. Surrounded by their families, who were now starting to bond and laugh together, they shared a quiet, perfect moment. As the song ended, James whispered to Sarah, "This is the start of our new life, isn't it?" Sarah smiled, looking up at him with love in her eyes. "It is, and I couldn't be happier." As they walked off the dance floor, hand in hand, Sarah felt a weight lift from her heart. This was the beginning of something beautiful, a new chapter where love and understanding would be the foundation for everything that came next. They were ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing that their families now stood together with them. Sarah had always dreamed of a wedding day filled with love, and tonight she had gotten much more than that. She had gotten the gift of unity, the gift of a family bound together by the love they had always shared, but now had learned to express openly.